Organs Without Bodies. Deleuze and Consequences. By Slavoj Zizek. Hegel 1, Taking Deleuze from Behind. In his autobiography, Somerset Maugham reports how he was always an avid reader of great philosophers and found in all of them something interesting to learn, a way to get in contact with them in all of them except Hegel, who remained totally foreign and impenetrable to him. The same figure of Hegel as the absolute otherness, the philosopher from whom one has to differentiate oneself, whatever this means, it is clear that it is incompatible with Hegelian absolute knowledge, persists in contemporary philosophy up to Deleuze. Besides Hegel, there are three other philosophers who are obviously hated by Deleuze: Plato, Descartes, and Kant. However, with the last three, he nonetheless finds a way to read them against the grain, to discover in their very theoretical practice procedures, of conceptual invention, of staging concepts, that offer a way to undermine their official position. Suffice it to recall the reading of Plato in the appendix to the Logic of Sense, which almost makes out of Plato the first anti-Platonist, the detailed reconstruction of the process of montage and staging that Descartes enacts in his construction of the concept of cogito, or the reading of Kant's multitude of the faculties of reason as opposed to the transcendental unity of the subject. In all three cases, Deleuze tries to enter the enemy's territory and twist, for his own ends, the very philosopher who should be his greatest enemy. However, there is no such operation with Hegel. Hegel is thoroughly bad, unredeemable. Deleuze characterizes his reading of philosophers as guided by the tendency to see the history of philosophy as a sort of buggery or, it comes to the same thing, immaculate conception. I saw myself as taking an author from behind and giving him a child that would be his own offspring, yet monstrous. It was really important for it to be his own child, because the author had to actually say all I had him saying. But the child was bound to be monstrous too, because it resulted from all sorts of shifting, slipping, dislocations, and hidden emissions that I really enjoyed. Perhaps this unexpected reference to the philosophical practice of buggery provides the best exemplification of what Deleuze is effectively aiming at through his insistence on the univocity of being, an attitude of perceiving disparate and incompatible events or propositions, immaculate conception, buggery, philosophical interpretation, as occurring at the same ontological level. It is therefore crucial to perceive how the proper attitude toward propositions like taking a philosopher from behind is not one of an obscene, condescending, and dismissive sneer but one of completely naive seriousness. Deleuze is not trying to amuse us by way of generating a shocking effect. And the same goes for Foucault who, in his genealogy, locates at the same level of univocity philosophical statements, economic debates, legal theories, pedagogical injunctions, sexual advice. This practice of buggery is also what distinguishes Deleuze from the field of deconstruction. Perhaps the most obvious sign of the gap that separates Deleuze from deconstruction is his fierce opposition to the latter's hermeneutics of suspicion. He advised his students to trust the author you are studying. Proceed by feeling your way. You must silence the voices of objection within you. You must let him speak for himself, analyze the frequency of his words, the style of his own obsessions. It would just be good if Deleuze were to display some readiness to follow this approach also in his reading of Hegel. Linked to this is the second feature separating Deleuze from deconstruction, which concerns his style of philosophical indirect free speech. Both Deleuze and Derrida deploy their theories through a detailed reading of other philosophers, that is to say, they both reject the pre-Kantian, uncritical, direct deployment of philosophical systems. For both of them, philosophy today can be practiced only in the mode of metaphilosophy, as a reading of other philosophers. But, while Derrida proceeds in the mode of critical deconstruction, of undermining the interpreted text or author, Deleuze, in his buggery, imputes to the interpreted philosopher his own innermost position and endeavors to extract it from him. So, while Derrida engages in a hermeneutics of suspicion, Deleuze practices an excessive benevolence toward the interpreted philosopher. At the immediate material level, Derrida has to resort to quotation marks all the time, signaling that the employed concept is not really his, whereas Deleuze endorses everything, directly speaking through the interpreted author in an indirect free speech without quotation marks. And, of course, it is easy to demonstrate that Deleuze's benevolence is much more violent and subversive than the Derridian reading. His buggery produces true monsters. One should resist the temptation to submit Deleuzian notions of immanence and pure presence of the flux of becoming to a direct Derridian critique, deconstructive reading, reproaching Deleuze with metaphysics of presence. It is not that such critique is simply wrong but, rather, that it misses the point by being too much up to the point, by hitting its target all too directly. Of course Deleuze asserts presence against representation, and so forth, but precisely this obvious fact renders palpable that we are dealing here with a radical misunderstanding. What gets lost in such a critique is the fact that Derrida and Deleuze speak different, totally incompatible, languages, with no shared ground between them. Deleuze is here deeply Lacanian. Does Lacan not do the same in his reading of Kant with Sada? Jacques-Alain Miller once characterized this reading with the same words as Deleuze. The aim of Lacan is to take Kant from behind, to produce the Sadian monster as Kant's own offspring. And, incidentally, does the same not go also for Heidegger's reading of pre-Socratic fragments? Is he also not taking from behind Parmenides and Heraclitus? Is his extensive explanation of Parmenides' being and thought are the same not one of the greatest buggeries in the history of philosophy? The term immaculate conception is to be linked to the notion, from the logic of sense, of the flow of sense as infertile, without a proper causal power. Deleuzian reading does not move at the level of the actual imbrication of causes and effects, it stands to realistic interpretations as anal penetration does with regard to proper vaginal penetration. This is the truth of Deleuze's indirect free speech, a procedure of philosophical buggery. Deleuze even introduces variations into this topic of taking a philosopher from behind. He claims that, in his book on Nietzsche, things got turned around so that it was Nietzsche who took him from behind, Spinoza resisted being taken from behind, and so forth. However, Hegel is the absolute exception, as if this exception is constitutive, a kind of prohibition of incest in this field of taking philosophers from behind, opening up the multitude of other philosophers available for buggery. And what if we are effectively dealing here with the prohibition of incest? This would mean that, in an unacknowledged way, Hegel is uncannily close to Deleuze. So, in short, why should we not risk the act of taking from behind Deleuze himself and engage in the practice of the Hegelian buggery of Deleuze? Therein resides the ultimate aim of the present booklet. What monster would have emerged if we were to stage the ghastly scene of the spectre of Hegel taking Deleuze from behind? How would the offspring of this immaculate conception look? Is Hegel really the one philosopher who is unbuggerable, who cannot be taken from behind? What if, on the contrary, Hegel is the greatest and unique self-buggerer in the history of philosophy? What if the dialectical method is the one of permanent self-buggering? Sada once wrote that the ultimate sexual pleasure is for a man to penetrate himself anally, having a long and plastic enough penis that can be twisted around even when erect, so that it is possible to do it. Perhaps this closed circle of self-buggery is the truth of the Hegelian circle. There is, nonetheless, a distinction between Deleuze and Hegel-Lacan with regard to practicing philosophy as buggery. While Deleuze himself does the act of buggery, Hegel and Lacan adopt the position of a perverse observer who stages the spectacle of buggery and then watches for what the outcome will be. Lacan thus stages the scene of Sada taking Kant from behind. This is how one has to read Kant with Sada to see the monster of Kant Sada being born, and Hegel also is the observer of a philosophical edifice buggering itself, thus generating the monster of another philosophy. At a recent public discussion that followed a talk on the ethics of betrayal, the Nietzschean noble betrayal as the highest sign of love and respect, of fidelity even, the author, a Derridian, was asked about his own attitude toward Derrida. Where is his own noble betrayal of Derrida, whom he never criticizes? The author's reply was that Derrida has no need of it, since he is all the time already betraying himself, questioning his own previous positions, etc. But, does the same not go much more for Lacan? Is he not permanently changing his position, so that when, in his great negative statement, he pathetically proclaims that there is no other of the other, and so forth, the question to be asked is, but who was the poor idiot who claimed that there is an other of the other in the first place? The answer is always Lacan himself a couple of years ago. And, is not the highest case of this procedure Lacan's standardized attacks on Hegel in the style of whatever I am saying? One thing is sure, it is not the Hegelian absolute knowledge, the Hegelian perfect circle of dialectical mediation. What if this not is Lacan's version of "this is not my mother"? And, what if the same goes for Deleuze? What if this exceptional role of Hegel, this refusal to take him from behind, betrays a fear of excessive proximity? What if Deleuze has to elevate Hegel into an absolute other who cannot be appropriated by free indirect speech because taking Hegel from behind would produce a monster unbearable for Deleuze himself? Deleuze equals Hegel, is this the ultimate infinite judgment? Or, as Catherine Malibu puts it, Deleuze, Hegel equals Ahab, white whale, the fixed exception, the one as the unity beneath multiplicity, no complexity, no impersonal intensities, no multitudes, just falsity embodied. This is why Deleuze even enjoins us to forget Hegel. This absolute rejection, this urge to stupidize Hegel, to present a straw man image of him, as amply demonstrated by Malibu, conceals, of course, a disavowed affinity. Frederick Jameson already drew attention to the fact that the central reference of Anti-Oedipus, the underlying scheme of its larger historical framework, is the pre-capitalist modes of production, the long fragment from the Grundrisse manuscripts in which we encounter Marx at his most Hegelian, its entire scheme of the global historical movement relying on the Hegelian process from substance to subject. And, what about the other key Deleuzian concept literally taken over from Hegel, that of the concrete universal? What Deleuze aims at with the concrete universality is the formal generative model of a process of becoming as opposed to the abstract universals, geniuses and species that serve to categorize mode of being, of established reality. Is Deleuze's critique of the Platonic logic of ideal universal types designating the same quality, set of properties, in the elements comprised by the type not strangely close to Hegel's critique of abstract universality? What is, effectively, the Hegelian self-movement of the notion about? Recall a boring academic textbook that, apropos of a philosophical problem or discipline, enumerates the series of predominant opinions or claims. The philosopher A claimed that soul is immortal, while the philosopher B claimed that there is no soul, and the philosopher C that soul is only the form of the body. There is something blatantly ridiculous and inadequate in presenting such a panoply of opinions of philosophers. Why? We, the readers, somehow feel that this is not philosophy, that a true philosophy must systematically account for this very multitude of opinions, positions, not just enumerate them. In short, what we expect is to get a report on how one opinion arises out of the inconsistencies or insufficiencies of another opinion, so that the chain of these opinions forms an organic whole, or, as Hegel would have put it, the history of philosophy itself is part of philosophy, not just a comparative report on whether and how different opinions are right or wrong. This organic interweaving of opinions, positions, is what Hegel calls the self-movement of the notion. This is why, when someone, even if, like Francis Fukuyama, he claims to be a Hegelian, begins a sentence with "Hegel believes that," he thereby automatically disqualifies himself not only as a Hegelian but also as a serious philosopher. Philosophy is emphatically not about the beliefs of different individual persons. And, what is the Hegelian Begriff as opposed to the nominalist notion, the result of abstracting shared features from a series of particular objects? Often, we stumble on a particular case that does not fully fit its universal species, that is atypical. The next step is to acknowledge that every particular is atypical, that the universal species exists only in exceptions, that there is a structural tension between the universal and the particular. At this point, we become aware that the universal is no longer just an empty neutral container of its subspecies but an entity in tension with each and every one of its species. The universal notion thus acquires a dynamics of its own. More precisely, the true universal is this very antagonistic dynamics between the universal and the particular. It is at this point that we pass from abstract to concrete universal, at the point when we acknowledge that every particular is an exception, and, consequently, that the universal, far from containing its particular content, excludes it, or is excluded by it. This exclusion renders the universal itself particular. It is not truly universal, since it cannot grasp or contain the particular content, yet this very failure is its strength. The universal is thus simultaneously posited as the particular. The supreme political case of such a gesture is the moment of revolutionary councils taking over, the moment of a historical collective freedom, of eternity in time, of what Benjamin called dialectic in suspense. Or, as Alain Badiou would have put it in his Platonic terms, in such historical moments, the eternal idea of freedom appears/transpires. Even if its realization is always impure, one should stick to the eternal idea, which is not just a generalization of particular experiences of freedom but their inherent measure. To which, of course, Hegel would have retorted that the thermitter occurs because such a direct actualization of freedom has to appear as terror. One should insert this appearance of freedom into the series of exceptional temporalities, together with the messianic time first formulated by Paul, the time when the end is near, the time of the end of time, as Giorgio Agamben puts it, when, in an ontological state of emergency, one should suspend one's full identification with one's socio-symbolic identity and act as if this identity is unimportant, a matter of indifference. This exceptional temporality is to be strictly distinguished from the ecstatic carnivalesque suspension of order in which things are turned upside down in a generalized orgy. This story of the Hegelian Deleuze goes on ad infinitum. When, with reference to Darwin, Deleuze emphasizes how variations within a universal kind are not the inessential, contingent particularities of a species, the irrational, conceptually irrelevant differences between individuals, but the crucial moments of evolution, of the emergence of the new, is he not more Hegelian than he is ready to admit? What's more, is the Deleuzian phase transition not strangely close to the old Hegelian, and, later, dialectical materialist, notion of the passage of quantity into new quality, namely, to the Hegelian critique of considering quantity independently of quality? No wonder one of Deleuze's references here is Ilya Prigogine, who, unique among today's theoreticians, had the courage to point out that, taken in itself, outside its ideological role, the philosophy of dialectical materialism is not without its merits. So, what if, like Ahab's becoming whale, Deleuze himself is caught in a strange becoming Hegel? The difference between Hegel and Deleuze is here much more difficult to determine than it may appear. Grosso modo, Deleuze wants to assert the primacy of the genetic process of differentiation against any mode of universal being, whereas Hegel's aim is to introduce movement into the very heart of conceptual universality. However, in this sense, is Hegel not also a conceptual nominalist like Deleuze? When Deleuze conceives of universality as individual, is he not again close to Hegel's notion of individuality as universal, in its self-relating negation of its particular properties? Deleuze's great anti-Hegelian motif is that of absolute positivity, his thorough rejection of negativity. For Deleuze, Hegelian negativity is precisely the way to subordinate difference to identity, to reduce it to a sublated moment of identity's self-mediation, identity of identity and difference. The accusation against Hegel is thus double. Hegel introduces negativity into the pure positivity of being, and Hegel introduces negativity in order to reduce differentiation to a subordinated/sublatable moment of the positive one. What remains unthinkable for Deleuze is simply a negativity that is not just a detour on the path of the one's self-mediation. One is tempted to defend Hegel here. Is what Hegel ultimately does to negativity not the unheard of positivization of negativity itself? Recall the most famous lines of all from the Sherlock Holmes stories, found in The Silver Blaze: "Is there any point to which you wish to draw my attention?" To the curious incident of the dog in the night time. The dog did nothing in the night time. That was the curious incident, remarked Sherlock Holmes. The absence itself is here perceived as a positive fact, we thus obtain a curious field in which absences accompany presences as just another set of positive facts. Perhaps this is how one should read Pascal: a picture includes absence and presence, pleasant and unpleasant. Reality excludes absence and unpleasantness. A picture, here synonymous with what Deleuze calls the flow of the sense event, is an immaterial texture in which absences themselves have positive existence, in contrast to the bodily real in which, as Lacan put it, nothing lacks, there are no absences. When, in February 2003, Colin Powell addressed the UN Security Council to advocate the attack on Iraq, the U.S. delegation asked the large reproduction of Picasso's Guernica on the wall behind the speaker's podium to be covered with a different visual ornament. Although the official explanation was that Guernica does not provide the adequate optical background for the televised transmission of Powell's speech, it was clear to everyone what the U.S. delegation was afraid of, that Guernica, the painting supposed to be about the catastrophic results of the German aerial bombing of the Spanish city in the Civil War, would give rise to the wrong kind of associations if it were to serve as the background to Powell advocating precisely the bombing of Iraq by the far superior U.S. Air Force. This is the power of negativity at its most elementary. If the U.S. delegation were to abstain from demanding that Guernica be covered up, probably no one would associate Powell's speech with the painting displayed behind him. The very change, the very gesture of concealing the painting, drew attention to it and imposed the wrong association, confirming its truth. Another subterranean link between Deleuze and Hegel is that of immanence. If there ever was a philosopher of unconditional immanence, it is Hegel. Is Hegel's elementary procedure not best encapsulated by his motto, from the introduction to phenomenology, according to which the difference between for us and in itself is itself for us, it is ourselves, in the immanence of our thought, who experience the distinction between the way things appear to us and the way they are in themselves. The distinction between appearance and transcendent reality is itself a fact of our experiential appearance. When we say that a thing is, in itself, in a certain way, this means it appears to us in this mode of being. More generally, absolute immanence also determines the status of Hegel's critique of Kant and the Kantian handling of antinomies/contradictions. Far from denying us access to the thing in itself, the antinomic or contradictory character of our experience of a thing is what brings us into direct contact with it. This is also how Hegel would have approached Kafka. The castle or court in themselves are just a reified projection of the immanent movement of our thought experience. It is not the inaccessible thing castle that is refracted inadequately in our inconsistent experience. On the contrary, the specter of the thing castle is the result of the inherent immanent refraction of our experience. And, finally, does the passage from one to another shape of consciousness in the phenomenology also not rely on the turn toward absolute immanence? When Hegel refutes asceticism, he does not proclaim it inadequate to the objective state of things, he simply compares it with the immanent life practice of the ascetic subject. It is this practice, in Deleuzian terms, what an ascetic subject does with asceticism, on behalf of it, that refutes what asceticism is. The wager of Deleuze's concept of the plane of consistency, which points in the direction of absolute immanence, is that of his insistence on the univocity of being. In his flat ontology, all heterogeneous entities of an assemblage can be conceived at the same level, without any ontological exceptions or priorities. To refer to the well-known paradoxes of inconsistent classification, the plane of consistency would be something like a mixture of elements thrown together through a multitude of divergent criteria. Recall Borges's famous taxonomy: brown dogs, dogs who belong to the emperor, dogs who don't bark, and so forth up to dogs who do not belong to this list. It would be all too easy to counter here that the Lacanian real is precisely that which resists inclusion within the plane of consistency, the absent cause of the heterogeneity of the assemblage. Is it, rather, not that this plane of consistency is what Lacan called the feminine non-all set, with no exceptions and, for that very reason, no totalizing agency? When, at the very end of Seminar 11, Lacan refers to Spinoza as the philosopher of the universal signifier and, as such, the true antipode of Kant. He makes the same point: Spinoza is the philosopher of feminine assemblage, against Kant as the philosopher of the masculine exception, the moral law that suspends the imbrication of phenomenal causes and effects. The Spinozan one whole is thus a non-totalized real, bringing us back to Lacan's fundamental thesis: the real is not simply external to the symbolic but, rather, the symbolic itself deprived of its externality, of its founding exception. What about Hegel? What if Hegel feminized Kant again by way of reducing the Kantian ontological opposition between phenomena and the thing in itself to the absolutely immanent tension inhering within phenomena themselves? It is thus already with Hegel that the logic of transgression, the idea that, to attain truth or ultimate reality, one has to violate the superficial order, with its rules, and force the passage to another dimension hidden beneath, is suspended. Hegel would undoubtedly fully endorse Deleuze's scathing remark about Bödeli, the ultimate thinker of transgression. Transgression, a concept good for seminarists under the law of a pope or a priest, the tricksters. Georges Bödeli is a very French author. He made the little secret the essence of literature, with a mother within, a priest beneath, an eye above. In a late story by Somerset Maugham, an older Frenchman has a paid young concubine. When he finds her in bed with a young man and she confesses that they really love each other, he proposes a unique solution. The two of them should marry, he will provide them with an apartment and a job for the young man. The price is that, twice a week, while the young man is at work, the old man will visit the young wife and make love to her. The solution is thus the reversal of the usual situation: instead of the young woman living with an old man and cheating on him with a young lover, she will live with the man whom she really loves and cheat on him with the old, unattractive man. Does this story not provide the clearest staging of the Battalian transgression? Bödeli's ultimate horizon is the tension between homogeneity and its heterogeneous excess, between the profane and the sacred, the domain of exchange, and the excess of pure expenditure. And, insofar as Bödeli's opposition of homogeneity and heterogeneity echoes Lacan's couple of S2 and S1, the chain of ordinary signifiers and the master signifier, this is how one should also read the series of S1 in Lacan's Seminar Encore, not as an ordinal series but as the series of excesses themselves. Or, to put it in Chesterton's terms, a miracle is no longer the irrational exception that disturbs the rational order. Since everything becomes a miracle, there is no longer the need to assert excess against normality. Since everything becomes an excess, excess is everywhere, in an unbearable intensity. Therein resides the true transgression. It occurs when the tension between the ordinary phenomenal reality and the transgressive excess of the real thing is abolished. In other words, the truly subversive agent asserts the univocity of being, assembling all the heterogeneous elements within the same plane of consistency. Instead of the ridiculously pathetic fake heroism of forcing the established order toward its transcendent dramatic core, we get a profoundly indifferent enumeration that, without the blink of an eye, puts in the same series ethics and buggery.